I invite you to a story about a man whose face the whole world knows today, though few remember who he truly was. This is the story of an extraordinary life that changed the course of history. On the $100 bill, the most recognizable banknote in the world, appears the face of an older man with a gentle, slightly ironic gaze. This bill circulates across every continent, passing through millions of hands each day, and yet most of the people who hold it could say nothing more about this man beyond his name, Benjamin Franklin. An American, of course. Someone important, certainly. But who exactly was this man? And why is it his image that appears on the highest denomination of American currency, ahead of every president of the United States? Franklin, after all, was never president, and yet his face proved more enduring than the likenesses of those who held that highest office. Answering that question requires traveling back more than 3 centuries, to a time when America was not yet a great power but a handful of British colonies scattered along the eastern seaboard, inhabited by people seeking a better life far from Europe's wars and religious persecutions. It also requires getting to know a man whose biography seems so improbable that if it were a work of fiction, critics would accuse the author of exaggeration and a lack of realism. Benjamin Franklin was a scholar of worldwide renown, a member of the most important scientific academies in Europe, a man whose discoveries and inventions transformed the daily lives of millions. And yet he was a man who had completed just 2 years of formal schooling. He was a philosopher and thinker whose writings were read throughout Enlightenment Europe, and at the same time a practical organizer who could turn his attention to matters as mundane as cleaning streets or fighting fires. He was a diplomat who represented a nascent nation at the courts of European monarchs, without any official status or credentials. He was, finally, a humanist and opponent of slavery who, a full quarter-century before the abolition of that institution in the United States, spoke out loudly against it, calling it a disgrace to humanity. This extraordinary story begins in a place that is today one of America's most important cities, but which at the start of the 18th century was a small, provincial town on the edge of the civilized world. Boston, in the year 1706, when Benjamin Franklin was born, had a population of only about 5,000. It was one of many small settlements dotted along the Atlantic coast, subject to the British Crown and living mainly from trade, fishing, and crafts. To reach London, the capital of the empire, one sailed across the ocean for many weeks, and news from Europe arrived with delays of many months. The colonists lived in a world that, from the perspective of European capitals, seemed like the end of the known earth, a place for those who, for various reasons, could not or would not remain in the old country. The Franklin family belonged precisely to that category of people who had consciously chosen the uncertainty of the New World over persecution in England. Benjamin's ancestors came from Northampton in central England, where they had practiced blacksmithing for generations. His father, Josiah Franklin, arrived in America in 1683 with his first wife and 3 children, fleeing the religious persecutions that still afflicted England at the time. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants of various denominations had not died out, despite the passage of decades since the Civil Wars. The Franklin family, adherents of one of the more radical forms of Protestantism, preferred to seek peace across the ocean rather than risk reprisals in their homeland. In Boston, Josiah Franklin could not continue the family trade of blacksmithing as the competition was too fierce, and he lacked the capital needed to establish a workshop. He therefore took up the making of soap and tallow candles. It was a profitable occupation, though not particularly well regarded socially. Soap production involved unpleasant smells and manufacturing processes that annoyed the neighbors. Nevertheless, the workshop prospered well enough for Josiah to support a family that grew larger with every passing year. After the death of his first wife, he remarried, and the combined number of his children reached 17, 7 from the first marriage and 10 from the second. Benjamin Franklin was Josiah's 15th child and his last son. After him came 2 more daughters. He might, therefore, have been lost in the crowd of siblings, remaining one of many craftsmen's children who grow up, learn a trade, and lead lives much like their parents. That was the normal fate in those times and that place. But nature, as if weary of producing mediocrity, decided to concentrate in this 15th child talents that in the other members of the family appeared at best in rudimentary form. This is not to say that the Franklin family was entirely without intellectual ambition. Josiah Franklin, despite his modest education and hard physical labor, was a man who valued conversation and the exchange of ideas. He loved music, sang beautifully, and could draw. At the table around which his large brood of children gathered, he conducted serious discussions on topics that ranged far beyond the daily concerns of the workshop. Meals in the Franklin household were simple, but the conversations over them were ambitious. One of Benjamin's uncles, though he worked at a humble trade, wrote poetry. There existed in this family, then, a certain impulse toward the life of the mind, a longing for something more than the daily struggle for survival. This impulse found fertile ground in Benjamin. The atmosphere of the family home, where little importance was attached to what one ate, but great importance to what one talked about, shaped him for the rest of his life. Into advanced old age he remained a man entirely indifferent to the pleasures of the table, but always eager for the exchange of ideas, for discussion, for joint reflection on matters great and small. This quality, carried from the crowded room of a Boston soap maker, proved to be one of the secrets of his later successes, both scientific and diplomatic. The Franklin household was also marked by an atmosphere of religious tolerance, which was rare at the time. Although the family had come to America fleeing persecution, although it belonged to a specific Protestant denomination, it did not cultivate hatred toward those of other faiths. Benjamin grew up with the conviction that a person could be good and virtuous regardless of how they worshipped God. This outlook, remarkable for the early 18th century, would later become one of the foundations of his worldview and would contribute to the formulation of one of the most revolutionary thoughts in his famous plan for moral self-improvement, in which he would place Jesus Christ and the pagan philosopher Socrates side by side as models worthy of emulation. The British colonies in America at the start of the 18th century were a harsh world, but one full of possibilities for those who could work hard and seize the opportunities that presented themselves. The rigid social structures of old Europe did not exist there. No aristocracy with centuries-old lineages, no guilds controlling access to trades. A person could rise or fall depending on their own abilities and industry. This social fluidity, impossible in the Europe of that time, was both an opportunity and a challenge. An opportunity because it allowed people of humble origin to reach heights inaccessible to them in the old world. A challenge because it offered no guarantees, no safety net for those who failed. In this world, on this raw frontier of civilization, in a family too large for any child to count on special attention or support, was born a man who would change the face of his continent and go down in history as one of the most outstanding minds of his age. On January 17, 1706, in a modest house on Milk Street in Boston, Abiah Franklin, Josiah's second wife, gave birth to a son who was given the name Benjamin. No one on that day could have imagined that this boy, the 15th of 17 children of a soap maker, would live to 84 and remain in active service to a country that did not yet exist, even in the imagination of the colonists, until his 82nd year. No one could have known that this craftsman's son would become a scholar, philosopher, diplomat, writer, and one of the founding fathers of a new nation. Childhood in a family of 17 children left little room for individual attention or special treatment. Benjamin, as one of the youngest, had from his earliest years to find his own way in the noisy, crowded house on Milk Street. Meals were simple, clothes passed down from older siblings to younger ones, and privacy was a concept virtually unknown. In such conditions, a child either disappears into the crowd or develops qualities that allow it to stand out. Benjamin chose the latter path, though it is hard to say whether this was a conscious choice or the natural consequence of his innate temperament. Even as a small child, he displayed a remarkable curiosity about the world and a capacity for independent thought. In his memoirs, written many years later, he noted that he could not remember a time when he did not know how to read. This skill had come to him so naturally and so early that the moment of its acquisition had faded from memory. For a child of a craftsman's family, in an era when illiteracy was the norm even among considerably wealthier social groups, this was an extraordinary ability. Books became his first great passion, a companion for solitary moments in the crowded house, a window onto a world infinitely wider than the streets of colonial Boston. Benjamin's father, Josiah Franklin, recognized the exceptional abilities of his youngest son and began to form plans for his future. In a family where most sons followed in their father's footsteps or took up other trades, one son destined for the clergy could be a source of pride and a means of social advancement for the whole family. A church career offered a chance to escape from the craftsman class, to gain the respect and position unavailable to a simple maker of soap or candles. Josiah therefore decided to invest in Benjamin's education, despite the family finances being stretched to the limit. At the age of 8, the boy was enrolled in the grammar school, one of the better educational establishments in Boston. This was a school that prepared pupils for further study and a clerical career, offering a solid grounding in Latin, rhetoric, and other subjects necessary for a future minister. Benjamin thrived there. His teachers noticed a sharp mind and an ease of learning. Everything pointed toward the father's dream of a son in the clergy having a chance of coming true. Financial reality proved merciless, however. After barely a year of study, Josiah had to withdraw his son from the grammar school. The tuition fees were too high for a family supported by a small soap-making workshop, and the needs of the remaining children did not allow for favoring one of them at the expense of all the others. This must have been a painful moment, both for the father, who watched his plan dissolve, and for Benjamin himself, who had only just begun to taste the pleasures of systematic learning. The compromise solution was George Brownell's school, a considerably cheaper establishment specializing in the teaching of writing and arithmetic. The name of this school sounded modest and prosaic, as did its educational ambitions. It did not prepare pupils for a clerical or university career, but for practical occupations requiring skills in calculation and correspondence. Benjamin spent another year there, after which this education too came to an end. 2 years of schooling constituted the whole of his formal education. Everything he subsequently achieved in science, philosophy, and literature, he owed entirely to self-instruction. The results of that second year of study were mixed. Benjamin mastered calligraphy to perfection. His handwriting was clear and elegant, which later proved an invaluable skill in his printing work and diplomatic correspondence. Arithmetic, on the other hand, gave him trouble. The same mind that would in the future make breakthrough discoveries in the field of electricity could not manage basic mathematical operations. This apparent contradiction teaches humility toward simple categorizations of human talent. Genius may manifest itself in one domain while remaining entirely hidden in another. At the age of 10, Benjamin definitively concluded his schooling and began working in his father's workshop. His duties were varied, and none of them could be considered particularly inspiring. He cut wicks for candles, delivered orders to customers, helped with soap making, and performed dozens of small tasks that made up the daily running of the family business. For most boys of his age and circumstances, this would have been the natural beginning of a path leading to taking over the workshop from his father or establishing a similar enterprise of his own. Benjamin, however, was clearly not suited to this role. Physical work in soap and candle making not only failed to interest him, but actively repelled him. The smells associated with soap production, the necessity of working with tallow and other unpleasant substances, the monotony of actions repeated day after day, all of this was difficult for him to endure. His thoughts wandered elsewhere, toward the books he devoured in every free moment, toward conversations he conducted with the few peers who shared his interests, toward dreams of a life different from the one that seemed destined for him. A particular fascination was exerted on him by the ocean. Boston was a port city, and the wharves were the natural playground of local boys. Benjamin spent long hours there, watching ships entering the harbor and setting out into the unknown, listening to sailors, tales of distant lands, breathing in the salty smell of the sea breeze. The sea represented everything that was missing in the soap workshop: adventure, freedom, unlimited possibility. The boy dreamed of one day climbing aboard one of those ships and sailing beyond the horizon, seeing Europe, getting to know the world he read about in books. These dreams troubled his father. Josiah Franklin had already lost one son to the sea, an older brother of Benjamin's who had signed on to a ship and disappeared. The prospect of losing another child to the unpredictable ocean was unacceptable to him. He therefore tried to dissuade Benjamin from his maritime fantasies, presenting the dangers of a sailor's life, the uncertainty of earnings, the distance from family. These arguments, however, fell on deaf ears. The boy was too young to truly understand the risks, and too hungry for adventure to abandon his dreams at the urging of paternal caution. Alongside his passions and dreams, the character of young Benjamin was also developing. He was a sociable boy who easily made friends among his peers. He had a natural inclination toward leadership, which manifested itself in games on the Boston waterfront, where he often organized joint ventures and settled disputes. He showed a pragmatism and organizational instinct remarkable for his age. In his memoirs, he described an episode in which he and his friends decided to build a platform for fishing. Benjamin noticed that nearby there were stones set aside for the construction of a new house. He persuaded his companions to move these stones under cover of night and use them to build the platform. The enterprise succeeded, but the following day the owner of the stones discovered the theft, and the boys were severely punished. Benjamin drew from this event a lesson he remembered for the rest of his life. Even an apparently good end does not justify dishonest means. The years spent in his father's workshop, though unwanted and frustrating, were not entirely wasted. Benjamin observed how his father conducted business, how he spoke with customers, how he managed the family finances. He was learning the practical aspects of entrepreneurship that later proved invaluable in his own career. Above all, however, he used every free moment for reading. He borrowed books wherever he could, from neighbors, acquaintances, sometimes from customers of the workshop. Every penny he managed to save he spent on purchasing further volumes. Josiah Franklin watched his son with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He could see his extraordinary abilities, his hunger for knowledge, his reluctance toward the family trade. He understood that trying to force this boy into the mold of a soap maker would end in failure. Benjamin would either run away to sea, fulfilling his dangerous dreams, or find some other way of escaping the destiny that weighed on him. The father decided, therefore, to seek a solution that would allow his son to develop his abilities while also learning a concrete, profitable trade. This solution came in the form of a proposal from Josiah's eldest son, from his first marriage, James Franklin, who operated a printing shop in Boston. The printing trade was a respected occupation, requiring intelligence and precision, and at the same time offering contact with the world of the printed word that so fascinated Benjamin. For a boy in love with books, the prospect of working among them and participating in the process of their creation must have seemed like the fulfillment of a dream. For the father, it was the ideal solution. His son would learn a concrete trade, would work under the supervision of his older brother, and would remain safely away from the dangers of a life at sea. When Benjamin was 12, a decision was made about his future. The boy was to leave the soap workshop and begin learning the printing trade in his brother James's establishment. James Franklin's print shop occupied a small premises on one of Boston's streets, filled with the smell of printing ink, fresh paper, and metal type. For a 12-year-old boy who had spent his entire previous life amid the fumes of tallow and soap, this was an almost magical place. The printing press, the rows of wooden type cases, the stacks of sheets awaiting impression, the finished publications. All of this created a world infinitely closer to his dreams than his father's workshop. Benjamin entered this new phase of life with hope and enthusiasm, not suspecting that bitter experiences also awaited him there. The conditions under which he began working for his brother were typical of the time, but, objectively speaking, extremely harsh. A formal indenture contract was signed between James and Benjamin, binding the younger brother to 8 years of service in the print shop. Throughout this entire period, Benjamin was to receive no wages, only a roof over his head, food, and instruction in the trade. Only in the final year of the contract was he entitled to a modest journeyman's wage. 8 years of unpaid work, in exchange for the opportunity to learn a trade, was the standard practice of the time. But for a boy endowed with a sense of self-worth and confidence in his own abilities, it must have been a source of growing frustration. James Franklin was a talented man, but a difficult one to live with. He was 9 years older than Benjamin, which placed him in the position not so much of an older brother as a strict master and employer. The difference in age and temperament led to constant tension. James, aware of his younger brother's talent, perhaps feared his competition. Benjamin, for his part, convinced that his own abilities surpassed those of James, found it hard to bear his subordinate position and the requirement of unconditional obedience. The relationship between the brothers, which might have been a source of mutual support, turned into a years-long conflict marked by mutual grievances and resentments. Work in the print shop was physically demanding and intellectually exacting. Benjamin learned to compose text from individual type pieces, operate the printing press, prepare ink of the right consistency, and ensure even impressions. Each of these tasks required precision and attention, and errors were punished with severe reprimands from James. The working day began at dawn and ended after dark, leaving little time for rest or personal pursuits. Yet Benjamin found a way to use that time for what he loved most. Every penny he happened to earn, every small payment for an additional commission, he spent on books. He formed friendships with apprentices in bookshops, who secretly lent him volumes from their employers' stores. Benjamin would take a book in the evening, read through most of the night by candlelight, and return it untouched and unnoticed in the morning before the bookshop opened. This practice required not only reading enthusiasm but also extraordinary discipline and the ability to function on minimal sleep. Young Franklin was forging habits that would accompany him for his entire life: frugality, industry, and the ability to make maximum use of available time. The reading of this period shaped his mind permanently. A particularly deep impression was made on him by John Locke's work entitled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. This monumental philosophical work, one of the foundations of the European Enlightenment, might have seemed too difficult for a teenage boy without formal education. Benjamin not only read it but thought deeply about it, and adopted it as the basis of his own way of looking at the world. Locke's empiricism, the conviction that knowledge derives from experience rather than innate ideas, became a permanent element of Franklin's worldview and influenced his later approach to science and experimentation. Equally important were Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, a collection of biographies of great figures of ancient Greece and Rome. Franklin read about Alexander and Caesar, about Pericles and Cato, about men who had shaped the destinies of their nations and inscribed themselves in history through great deeds. These stories must have worked powerfully on the imagination of a young man imprisoned in the position of an unpaid printer's apprentice. If they could rise above the circumstances of their birth, perhaps he too would one day find a way to do something great. The third author who exercised a lasting influence on Benjamin was Daniel Defoe. Not only as the creator of Robinson Crusoe, though that tale of a man thrown back on his own resources on a desert island must have spoken to a boy dreaming of adventure, but above all as the author of numerous essays and practical guides on the practical aspects of life. Defoe wrote about trade, entrepreneurship, morality, and society. His style was clear, direct, and free of academic pretension. From him, Franklin learned not only content, but form, the way of conveying ideas in an accessible and persuasive manner. Learning to write became for Benjamin as important as reading itself. He understood that the ability to express thoughts clearly was the key to influencing others, to a career that transcended physical labor. He devised his own method of refining his style, which testifies to his extraordinary self-discipline and systematic approach. He would take articles from periodicals, read them attentively, then set them aside and try to reconstruct their content in his own words. He would then compare his version with the original, analyzing the differences and learning from his own mistakes. Sometimes he transformed prose into verse and then back into prose, in order to better understand the rhythm and structure of language. This laborious, self-directed work bore fruit. The style of Benjamin Franklin, clear, matter-of-fact, free of ornamentation, but full of valuable insights, became a model of functional prose. In 1721, James Franklin began publishing a newspaper under the title The New England Courant. It was an ambitious and risky venture. The paper took a critical stance toward local authorities, the clergy, and various manifestations of hypocrisy in colonial life. In a community as small as Boston, such positions required courage, but also exposed the publisher to numerous difficulties. James needed material for publication, and Benjamin saw in this an opportunity to test his literary ambitions. The problem was that James would never have taken seriously the texts of his teenage apprentice. Benjamin therefore chose the path of deception. He wrote an article, signed it with the pseudonym Silence Dogood, and slipped it under the door of the print shop, pretending it was correspondence from an anonymous female reader. Silence Dogood was to be a middle-aged widow, a sensible and witty woman who commented on various aspects of social life with ironic detachment. James judged the text excellent and published it. The success was immediate. Readers loved Silence Dogood and demanded more. Benjamin continued writing, producing 14 essays over the course of a few months. He addressed topics ranging from criticism of false piety to women's right to education, from analysis of human nature to reflections on the meaning of life. For a 17-year-old without formal education, these were remarkable achievements. Each text demonstrated not only literary ability, but also deep reflection on human and social affairs. Silence Dogood became a popular figure, and her texts were widely discussed and quoted. When the truth finally came to light, James's reaction was far from pride in his talented brother. He felt deceived and humiliated by the fact that his younger apprentice, a boy theoretically at the lowest rung of the print shop hierarchy, had proved to be the author of the newspaper's most popular material. Instead of recognition, Benjamin was met with even harsher treatment. The relationship between the brothers, already strained, became almost unbearable. The situation deteriorated further when James ran into trouble because of his publications. The Boston authorities, outraged by his critical articles, arrested him and prohibited him from publishing the newspaper under his own name. To circumvent this ban, James decided to publish the paper formally under Benjamin's name. This required canceling the old indenture contract and signing a new, secret one that restored the previous terms. Benjamin was to be the official publisher, but unofficially remained dependent on his brother. This situation gave Benjamin a weapon he did not hesitate to use. He understood that James could not publicly acknowledge the existence of the secret contract, as this would mean legal trouble. When the conflicts between the brothers reached a critical point, when Benjamin could no longer endure the unjust treatment and the refusal of any payment for his work, he decided to leave. James had no way to stop him without exposing the deception to the authorities. Benjamin was free, but this freedom came at a price. James made sure that no other printer in Boston would employ his rebellious brother. The 17-year-old Benjamin faced a choice: accept the situation and return to James's authority, or leave the city and seek his fortune elsewhere. For a young man endowed with ambition, talent, and confidence in his own worth, the choice was obvious. Boston had become too small for both Franklin brothers. Benjamin decided to leave without informing anyone of his plans, leaving behind his family, his acquaintances, and the only city he had ever known. The journey from Boston to New York, and from there to Philadelphia, was for the 17-year-old Benjamin a voyage into the unknown. He had never before left his home city, never traveled alone, never had to rely entirely on his own wits and resourcefulness. Now, without money, without connections, without a letter of recommendation that might open doors with potential employers, he set out into the world with the only capital he possessed: his printing skills, his capacity for hard work, and his unshakable faith in himself. New York proved a disappointment. The city was admittedly larger than Boston, but the only print shop operating there had no need of workers. The owner, seeing a tired and poorly dressed young man, advised him to try his luck in Philadelphia, where one of the printers was reportedly looking for an assistant. Benjamin had no choice. He spent the remainder of his modest savings on a journey first by boat across the bay, then on foot across part of New Jersey, and finally by another boat across the Delaware River. His arrival in Philadelphia took place in October 1723, and the circumstances of that arrival lodged themselves deeply in Franklin's memory. Many years later, writing his memoirs, he described the scene with a precision that testified to its emotional significance. He stepped off the boat onto the wharf, dirty, tired, and wearing clothes worn out by travel. In his pocket he had $1 Dutch and about a shilling in copper coins. He knew not a soul in the city, had no idea where to find lodgings or work. He was hungry, so his first task was to find a bakery. The price of bread in Philadelphia turned out to be lower than in Boston, which filled him with unexpected pleasure. For 3 pennies he received 3 large rolls, more than he could eat. He therefore walked along Market Street, carrying 1 roll under each arm and eating the third. The sight of a young man in ragged clothes, with 3 rolls and an expression of bewilderment, must have looked comical. Among the people who noticed him at that moment was a young woman standing in the doorway of one of the houses. She smiled at the sight of this awkward newcomer, not knowing she was looking at her future husband. This woman's name was Deborah Reed, and she was the daughter of the landlady, from whom Franklin would soon rent a room. Their paths crossed on that first day in Philadelphia, though many years would pass before fate united them for good. For the time being, Benjamin had more pressing matters on his mind than thoughts of girls. He had to find work, a roof over his head, and some support in an unfamiliar city. Fortune favored him. The print shop of Samuel Keimer, to which he had been directed back in New York, did indeed need a worker. Keimer was an eccentric man, of unstable character and questionable professional skills. His print shop was in a sorry state, the equipment worn out, and the organization of work chaotic. For Benjamin, however, it was an opportunity he could not refuse. He was hired and immediately set about clearing up the disorder, repairing equipment, and introducing the methods he had learned in his brother's shop. The industry and competence of young Franklin quickly attracted the attention of Philadelphia's residents. In a small colonial city where everyone knew everyone, word of a capable and honest printer spread rapidly. One of the people who heard about Benjamin was the governor of Pennsylvania himself, William Keith. The governor, intrigued by stories about the talented young man, decided to meet him personally. The visit of such a distinguished person to Keimer's modest print shop was an unprecedented event and left the owner dumbfounded. Keith proved to be an agreeable man full of promises. He encouraged Benjamin to set up his own print shop, promising government commissions and financial support. He even suggested he could help him obtain credit to purchase equipment in England. For a 17-year-old without a penny to his name, these were words like manna from heaven. Franklin believed the governor and began preparations for a voyage to London, where he was to acquire the printing presses and type needed to establish his own workshop. Reality proved brutal. Governor Keith was known throughout the colony as a dreamer, a man generous with promises he had neither the intention nor the ability to keep. The letters of recommendation and financial credits that were supposed to be waiting for Benjamin on the ship were never written. The young Franklin discovered the truth only after arriving in London, when it turned out he was alone, without resources and without any support, in the largest city in the contemporary world. It was a bitter lesson, but also a valuable one. It taught him caution toward flatterers and skepticism toward promises made too easily. London, despite the difficult circumstances of his arrival, proved to be an important stage in Franklin's education. He found work in reputable print shops, where he encountered the latest techniques and the highest standards of the craft. He worked hard, lived frugally, and devoted his free time to reading and forming connections in intellectual circles. He spent nearly 2 years in England, accumulating experiences and contacts that served him well in later life. His return to Philadelphia came in 1726. Benjamin was now 20 years old, with several years of professional experience and a considerably better understanding of human nature. He returned to work for Keimer, but knew already that this was a temporary solution. His goal was to establish his own workshop. This time, however, he intended to achieve it by his own efforts, without relying on the empty promises of powerful patrons. During this period, Franklin began to formulate the principles by which he intended to guide his life. These were reflections on his own experiences, insights drawn from reading, observations of human nature. He decided to set them down in the form of a systematic plan for moral self-improvement, which was to help him become a better person. The list comprised 13 virtues that Franklin considered fundamental: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Each of these virtues was precisely defined. Temperance meant eating without surfeit and drinking without intoxication. Silence required speaking only what could benefit others or oneself, avoiding trivial conversation. Order demanded that everything have its place and every matter its time. Franklin devised a method of tracking his progress, keeping a kind of journal in which he noted every violation of any of the virtues. The goal was the gradual elimination of weaknesses and the building of a character resting on solid foundations. A special place on the list was occupied by the 13th point, entitled humility. Franklin defined it in words that could shock in Puritan America. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. Placing the founder of Christianity alongside a pagan philosopher of ancient Greece was an act of intellectual courage. It testified to the fact that the young printer had already moved far beyond the traditional religious framework of his milieu, that he sought wisdom wherever it could be found, regardless of confessional labels. The plan for moral self-improvement did not remain a private matter for Franklin. He began sharing his reflections with a small group of friends, young people of similar interests and ambitions. They met in his rented room, discussing books, philosophy, and the possibilities of improving themselves. From these informal conversations emerged the idea of regular meetings at which the members of the group could work together on their moral and intellectual development. The first venue for these gatherings was a tavern, but it quickly became apparent that the atmosphere of a public house was not conducive to serious discussion. They moved therefore to private premises, where they could talk without interruption and without fear of being overheard. The group adopted a rule of strict discretion. Members undertook not to reveal to outsiders the content of the discussions or the identities of the participants. This atmosphere of trust permitted an honesty that would have been impossible in a more public context. Franklin, as the initiator and principal organizer of the meetings, prepared topics for discussion and ensured adherence to the agreed rules. Each meeting followed a similar pattern. Conversations addressed specific moral, philosophical, or practical questions. Members shared knowledge gained from reading, discussed problems encountered in daily life, and sought solutions together. It was a form of mutual education in which each participant was simultaneously a student and a teacher. The composition of the group reflected Franklin's democratic ideals. There was no place in it for distinctions of rank or wealth. At the same table sat printers, craftsmen, small merchants, and people of various occupations and backgrounds. What united them was a desire for knowledge and self-improvement, a conviction that through their own efforts a person could rise above the circumstances of their birth. In the society of colonial America, where class distances were admittedly smaller than in Europe but still perceptible, such a gathering of people from different strata was something unusual. The philosophy underlying these meetings was expressed in the conviction that the improvement of the individual leads to the improvement of society. Franklin believed that if every person worked on their character with the same systematic dedication they brought to their occupation, the world would become a better place to live. This faith in the possibility of moral progress, in the human capacity for self-improvement, was one of the foundations of Enlightenment thought, and Benjamin Franklin became one of its fullest embodiments on this side of the Atlantic. The roll of bread given to a destitute woman on the wharf, on the day of his arrival in Philadelphia, had been the first visible sign of this attitude. The plan for moral self-improvement was its theoretical justification. The weekly meetings of his group of friends became the laboratory in which these ideas were tested and developed. From these modest beginnings grew a philosophy of life that shaped not only Franklin himself, but, through his writings and example, influenced generations of Americans, and not only Americans, seeking a path to a better life. The Friday evening meetings began to attract an ever wider circle of interested participants. Word of a group of young people discussing philosophy, morality, and the improvement of character spread through Philadelphia, arousing the curiosity of some and the suspicion of others. Franklin observed with satisfaction as his private initiative took on the character of a phenomenon extending beyond the circle of his closest friends. What had begun as intimate gatherings of a few craftsmen was gradually transforming into a movement of considerably wider reach. The name Junto that the group adopted came from Spanish and meant simply an assembly or meeting. To outside observers it might have sounded somewhat exotic, perhaps even suspicious, but the members valued it precisely for that touch of mystery. It was not, however, a conspiratorial organization or a religious sect. It was simply a group of people convinced that through joint reflection and mutual support they could become better versions of themselves, and thereby contribute to the improvement of the society in which they lived. The rules of the Junto's operation were worked out by Franklin, with his characteristic systematism. Every new member had to answer a series of questions regarding their intentions and convictions. Do you respect all the present members? Do you believe in freedom of conscience? Are you willing to help other members in their undertakings? These simple questions created the foundation of mutual trust, without which honest discussions about one's own weaknesses and the striving toward perfection would have been impossible. The group initially numbered 12 members, and for a long time maintained this number, accepting new members only to replace those who left for various reasons. The meetings had an established ritual that gave them gravity and structure. They began with questions that each member had to put to themselves publicly. Since our last meeting, have you observed any particular fact worth sharing with the group? Have you heard of the failure of some venture? And can you explain its causes? Is there someone you know of who needs help of the kind the Junto's members might provide? These questions compelled participants to observe actively the world around them, to think in terms of community, and not only their own interests. The owner of the premises in which the meetings were held initially regarded them with distrust. A group of young men assembling regularly every week might spell trouble, political conspiracies, or at least drinking bouts disturbing the neighbors' peace. When he realized, however, that the members of the Junto did not even drink beer, did not quarrel, and conducted only serious conversations about books and morality, he not only allowed the meetings to continue, but began to regard the group with a degree of respect. This acceptance from the older generation was for Franklin proof that his method worked, that people could be persuaded not through confrontation, but through the example of one's own conduct. One of the most important principles adopted by the Junto's members was the avoidance of categorical statements in discussion. Franklin had noticed that words like undoubtedly, certainly, and obviously provoke resistance in one's interlocutor, even if the proposition being advanced is correct. Instead, members were to use expressions such as, "It seems to me," "unless I am mistaken," or "I find myself inclined to believe." This seemingly minor change in manner of expression had profound consequences. Conversations became less confrontational. Participants listened to one another more readily, and persuading opponents came more easily when they did not feel attacked or compelled to defend their position. For Franklin, this principle became the foundation of his later successes in dealing with people. He understood that people are more willing to change their minds when they do not have to admit, in doing so, that they were wrong. Expressions that left a margin of uncertainty gave the interlocutor space to withdraw from an earlier position without losing face. What might have appeared as modesty or uncertainty was in reality a sophisticated technique of persuasion that Franklin mastered to perfection and applied throughout his life in the most varied circumstances. The reputation he was building through the Junto and his printing activities began to translate into concrete professional opportunities. In 1729, Franklin took over a failing newspaper and transformed it into the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was a risky decision, requiring courage and faith in his own abilities. The paper had a poor reputation, a small circulation, and mounting debts. The previous owner had relinquished it with evident relief. Franklin, however, saw potential where others saw only difficulties and inevitable failure. Under his direction, the paper was transformed beyond recognition. Franklin wrote most of the material himself, ensuring its appeal and accessibility to a wide readership. He introduced humorous columns, printed readers, letters, and commented on local events with his characteristic blend of seriousness and irony. He avoided empty sensationalism or cheap provocation. He wanted his newspaper to be both entertainment and a source of valuable information, so that the reader would set it down, feeling that the time spent reading it had not been wasted. Success came gradually, but consistently. With each passing year, the circulation grew, advertisers increased in number, and the Pennsylvania Gazette became one of the most influential periodicals in the colonies. Franklin reinvested profits in the development of the enterprise, purchasing better printing presses, hiring assistants, and extending distribution to surrounding towns. The printing house on Market Street became one of the most important centers of Philadelphia's intellectual life, a place where people who wanted to know what was happening in the world gathered together. In parallel with the newspaper, Franklin began publishing an almanac that proved a phenomenal commercial success. The almanac was in 18th century America a universally used publication combining the functions of a calendar, agricultural guide, and collection of practical information useful in daily life. Franklin enriched this proven formula with aphorisms, maxims, and witty sayings that quickly entered general circulation. The fictional character Franklin created as the narrator of the almanac became an almost cult figure in the colonies, and his sayings were quoted at family tables, in taverns, and at public gatherings. Financial success did not change Franklin's fundamental habits. He remained a frugal man, avoiding unnecessary expenses and ostentatious consumption. These principles he had derived from his plan for moral self-improvement and applied consistently throughout his life. Wealth was for him a means to the realization of greater goals, not an end in itself. A significant portion of the profits went to undertakings he considered beneficial to the community, even when they yielded no direct financial return and might appear to some to be a waste of money. One such undertaking was the establishment of the first public lending library in the colonies. The idea was simple, but in the conditions of the time almost revolutionary. Books in 18th century America were expensive and inaccessible to most people. Even educated craftsmen and more prosperous merchants could rarely afford a private collection extending beyond a few basic volumes. Franklin proposed a system in which a group of people would pool their resources to purchase books jointly, which could then be borrowed by all members of the association. In the early 1730s, the Library Company of Philadelphia came into being, the first institution of its kind in America. The success of the library exceeded the boldest expectations. Within a few years, similar institutions began to appear in other towns of the colonies, modeling themselves on the Philadelphia example. Franklin observed with satisfaction as his idea spread, democratizing access to knowledge that had previously been the privilege of the few. In his later memoirs, he assessed that public libraries had contributed to raising the intellectual level of the entire American population, preparing the ground for future social changes. Franklin's public activities did not, however, confine themselves to the intellectual sphere. Observing the everyday problems of the growing city of Philadelphia, he saw possibilities for practical improvements that could enhance the lives of ordinary residents. One of the most prosaic but also most pressing problems was the maintenance of clean streets. Philadelphia, like other cities of the era, struggled with mud, refuse, and general disorder in the public space. No one felt responsible for cleaning up, and the city authorities had neither the resources nor the organization to deal with this effectively. Franklin set about solving the problem by the methods that had become his hallmark. Instead of appealing to the authorities or complaining about others' inertia, he went from door to door himself, collecting signatures for a petition to organize regular street cleaning, and gathering contributions toward this end from interested residents. He organized neighborhood meetings, persuaded the reluctant, and presented practical arguments concerning public health and the convenience of daily life. When sufficient funds had been raised, people were hired to perform work that no one had previously wished to undertake. The success of the venture encouraged the city authorities to assume responsibility and create a permanent system of maintenance. By similar methods, Franklin organized the first volunteer fire brigade in Philadelphia. Fires were a plague of the wooden cities of colonial America, and the existing methods of fighting them consisted mainly of the chaotic rush of residents with buckets of water, which rarely availed against more serious conflagrations. Franklin wrote an article in his newspaper describing the benefits of organized fire protection, and then convened a meeting of interested citizens. The Union Fire Company was formed, whose members undertook to keep the necessary equipment in readiness and to respond to every alarm at any hour of the day or night. This model was quickly copied by other parts of the city, and Philadelphia became one of the safest cities in the colonies in terms of fire. Franklin derived no financial benefit from this enterprise, treating it as a public service and a duty toward the community that had given him his chance for success. This attitude, combining practical sense with idealistic motivation, characterized all his subsequent social initiatives. His organizational successes did not go unnoticed by his fellow citizens. In 1736, Franklin was elected Secretary of the Pennsylvania Legislative Assembly. The following year he was entrusted with the position of Postmaster of Philadelphia. For someone who barely 13 years earlier had arrived in the city as a poor boy without a penny to his name, this was a spectacular advancement, demonstrating that in America it was indeed possible to rise above the circumstances of one's birth through one's own work and talents. The position of postmaster, which to a modern person might seem a secondary post, was in 18th century America one of immense importance difficult to overstate. The postal service was the only means of communication over greater distances, the link connecting the colonies scattered along the coast and the window onto the outside world. Franklin reorganized the postal service with his characteristic energy, introducing regular routes, shortening delivery times, and improving the reliability of the entire system. These experiences proved invaluable in later years, when he took on an even more senior position in the postal administration. The crowning achievement of his organizational activity in this period was bringing into being a higher educational institution. Franklin believed deeply in the power of education, and was pained by the fact that young people from the colonies who wished to obtain a higher education had to undertake a costly and dangerous voyage to Europe. In 1749, his years of effort finally bore fruit. An academy was opened that later developed into one of the most important American universities, educating successive generations of doctors, lawyers, scientists, and public figures. Franklin's interest in natural phenomena dated back to his early youth, when as a boy he had watched storms over Boston and wondered about the nature of the lightning illuminating the sky. These childhood fascinations remained for many years in the realm of unsatisfied curiosity, yielding to more pressing matters: learning a trade, struggling for livelihood, building a professional and social position. Only when the printing house and newspaper had begun to yield stable income, when the library and other public ventures had already been launched, could Franklin permit himself to return to the questions that had troubled him since childhood. Electricity was in the mid-18th century a phenomenon that fascinated both scholars and the general public. In European and American drawing rooms, demonstrations were staged in which, using simple apparatus, sparks were generated, objects were electrified, and current was even passed through chains of people holding hands, to the general amusement and astonishment of the audience. These were, however, mainly social entertainments, having more in common with magic and illusionism than with systematic scientific investigation. The nature of electricity remained a mystery, and its connection with lightning was merely a subject of speculation. Franklin encountered electrical demonstrations during one of his journeys, and immediately recognized in this phenomenon something more than entertainment for bored ladies and gentlemen. His practical mind, shaped by years of craftwork and organizational activity, sought applications and explanations. If electricity could be generated and stored using simple devices, what exactly was it? What laws governed its behavior? And above all, were lightning bolts, which since the dawn of history had inspired awe and dread in humanity, the same phenomenon that could be produced in a laboratory? The experiments began in the late 1740s. Franklin organized a makeshift laboratory in his home, assembling instruments purchased in Europe, and constructing his own devices according to ideas that came to him in the course of the work. He was in this enterprise a typical autodidact, lacking formal education and academic connections, but endowed with an extraordinary capacity for observation and for drawing conclusions from the experiments he conducted. One of Franklin's first important discoveries was the distinction between two kinds of electrical charge, which he named positive and negative. This terminology, proposed by a man without a university degree, was accepted by the scientific world and remains in use today. Franklin observed that charges of the same kind repel each other, while opposite charges attract. He also formulated the principle of conservation of electric charge, according to which electricity neither arises from nothing nor disappears, but merely moves between objects. These were fundamental observations forming the basis of the later development of the science of electricity. The most spectacular and most dangerous experiment was the kite experiment conducted during a thunderstorm. Franklin wished to prove that lightning was electrical in nature, identical to what could be produced in a laboratory. The plan was simple in conception, but dangerous in execution. A kite was to be sent up into storm clouds, and it was to be determined whether an electrical charge would travel down the string. Many later experimenters who tried to repeat this experience paid for it with their lives. Franklin had the good fortune, or the instinct, to take adequate precautions. The experiment was a success. Sparks jumping from the string to a metal key tied at its end proved conclusively that lightning is an electrical phenomenon. This discovery had significance not only theoretical. Franklin immediately began thinking about practical applications. If lightning was an electrical current, it could be directed and conducted safely to ground, protecting buildings from fires caused by lightning strikes. Thus was born the idea of the lightning rod, an invention that has saved countless human lives and property throughout the world. The construction of the lightning rod was simple and elegant, as all the best inventions are. A metal rod placed at the top of a building, connected by a wire to the earth, attracted atmospheric discharges and conducted them safely past the structure of the building and its occupants. Franklin did not patent his invention and made no attempt to derive financial gain from it. He believed that scientific discoveries and practical inventions should serve all humanity, not the private enrichment of their creators. This attitude, though it might have seemed naive from a business perspective, brought him something more valuable than money, universal respect, and the reputation of a man working selflessly for the public good. Word of Franklin's experiments and his invention spread through Europe with a speed remarkable for that time. Scholars from England, France, Germany, and other countries wrote to the Philadelphia printer, requesting details of his research, exchanging observations, and proposing collaboration. Franklin responded to these letters with his characteristic courtesy and modesty, sharing his knowledge without reservation and encouraging others to conduct their own experiments. This intellectual openness and generosity won him the friendship and esteem of the most outstanding minds of the age. The Royal Society in London, the oldest and most prestigious scientific institution in the English-speaking world, elected Franklin to its membership. This was an extraordinary honor for anyone, and all the more so for a man without formal education, from the provincial colonies across the ocean. Then came further distinctions: membership in the scientific academies of France, Germany, Italy, and other European countries. Franklin, who had completed just 2 years of school, became one of the most respected scholars of his age, invited to correspond with men who had spent their entire lives at universities. Franklin's scientific interests were not, however, confined to electricity alone. His curious mind ranged in the most varied directions, seeking explanations for phenomena observed in daily life and possibilities for practical improvement. He wrote works on meteorology, attempting to understand the laws governing weather and to predict approaching storms. He occupied himself with the theory of ship construction, seeking ways to increase their speed and safety. He investigated the properties of heat and cold, which led him to construct a more efficient heating stove that could warm rooms using less wood. Even his old passion for music found expression in inventive activity. Franklin constructed a musical instrument called the glass harmonica, consisting of rotating glass bowls of various sizes, which the player touched with moistened fingers to produce ethereal, unusual sounds. This instrument gained popularity in Europe, and composers such as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote works for it. It was one of many examples of Franklin's ability to combine science, art, and practical ingenuity in ways that delighted his contemporaries. A separate place in his research was occupied by an observation he described in one of his scientific letters. He noticed that oil poured on troubled water has a calming effect on the waves. This simple observation, born of curiosity and attentive observation of the surroundings, had later practical applications in maritime rescue and oceanographic research. Franklin treated no phenomenon as too trivial to deserve attention. Everything he saw around him could become an object of inquiry and a source of useful knowledge. Franklin's scientific method differed from the approach of the academic scholars of his era. He was not interested in abstract speculation or the building of grand theoretical systems. He always started from a concrete observation, from a question arising in confrontation with reality. He then formulated a hypothesis and sought a way to test it through experiment. If the experiment confirmed the hypothesis, he sought a practical application for the knowledge gained. If it contradicted it, he modified the hypothesis and tried again. This pragmatic empiricism, free of academic pretension, proved extraordinarily fruitful and inspired later generations of researchers. The scientific fame of Franklin brought him something more than titles and medals. It gave him a position that no politician or man of wealth from the colonies could achieve. The position of a man respected in Europe, regardless of his American origin. When European scholars and aristocrats thought of America, they saw no longer only distant colonies producing tobacco and cotton, but also a place where minds of the caliber of Europe's most outstanding intellectuals were born. Franklin became living proof that the New World had something to offer the Old, in the realm of the spirit and intellect as well as in commerce. Within America itself, his scientific authority translated into growing influence in public affairs. The man who had grasped the secret of lightning and harnessed it for humanity's benefit seemed predestined to solve other problems with which the colonies were struggling as well. As tensions grew between the American settlers and the British Crown, as the first signals of approaching conflict appeared, Franklin was the natural candidate to represent the interests of the colonies on the international stage. His scientific work encompassed several dozen publications, hundreds of letters exchanged with scholars throughout the world, and inventions used on every continent. And yet science was only one of the many occupations of this remarkable man, who simultaneously ran a printing house, published a newspaper, organized public institutions, and engaged in the political life of his province. This ability to operate on many fronts at once, to unite theory with practice, science with entrepreneurship, reflection with action, made him an extraordinary figure even in an age that produced many people of remarkably diverse interests and talents. Nor can the influence he exercised on the formation of American identity be overstated. Franklin proved that a person of humble social origins, lacking patronage and inherited privileges, could reach the heights in every sphere of human activity. His life became a living illustration of the conviction that in America what matters is not birth, but talent and industry. This conviction, though it often diverged from the social reality of the colonies, became one of the foundations of the American founding myth and survives to this day as a significant element of American self-understanding. The reputation of scholar and organizer of public life opened before Franklin doors that remain closed to ordinary colonists. In the mid-1750s, the Pennsylvania Legislative Assembly entrusted him with a diplomatic mission. He was to travel to London as the colony's representative, to defend its interests in a dispute with the Penn family, the proprietors of Pennsylvania, who refused to pay taxes on their extensive land holdings. It was a matter seemingly local, but in truth touching on the fundamental questions of the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. Before departing for England, Franklin had to put his personal affairs in order. His relationship with Deborah Reed, the woman he had first seen on the day of his arrival in Philadelphia, had passed through many trials over the years. The history of their connection was complicated and marked by mistakes for which Franklin took full responsibility. When, as a young man, he had first traveled to London, he had promised Deborah that he would write and would return to marry her. This promise he had not kept. During nearly 2 years in England, he had given her no sign of life, absorbed by work, new acquaintances, and his fascination with the great city. Deborah, left without news, found herself in a difficult situation. Her parents pressed her to marry while she was still young. She eventually yielded to their insistence and married a man named Rogers, who appeared to be a solid marriage prospect. The marriage proved a disaster. Rogers quickly squandered his wife's dowry, turned out to be irresponsible, and was likely a bigamist who had another wife in England. Eventually, he fled to the Caribbean, where he died in unexplained circumstances, leaving Deborah with the status of an abandoned wife who was not permitted to remarry, since it was uncertain that her husband was truly dead. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia, he found Deborah in this desperate situation. A sense of guilt for what had befallen her accompanied him for the rest of his life. It was his silence that had driven her into the arms of an unworthy man. His unkept promise had set off the chain of events that destroyed her youth and reputation. Franklin decided to make amends in the only way possible. In 1730, despite Deborah's uncertain legal status, he entered into a common-law marriage with her, taking her into his home as his wife. This union, though begun in the shadow of past mistakes, proved lasting and, in its own way, happy. Deborah was not a learned woman, or an intellectually refined one. She did not take part in her husband's philosophical discussions, did not read his scientific treatises, and did not accompany him on his travels to Europe. She was, however, an excellent housekeeper, a loyal companion, and the mother of his children. She managed the home and the business in her husband's absence, attended to the family finances, and supported him in the practical aspects of life. Franklin valued these virtues and never publicly expressed disappointment at the intellectual difference separating him from his wife. His departure for London in 1757 meant a prolonged separation for the marriage. Deborah did not wish to or could not accompany her husband on the voyage across the ocean. Franklin promised he would return as quickly as possible, but the Penn affair proved far more complicated than he had anticipated. The stay in England stretched on from year to year. Letters between the spouses crossed the Atlantic, full of assurances of mutual longing, but also testifying to a growing distance. Franklin lived an intense social and intellectual life in London, while Deborah waited alone in Philadelphia. The diplomatic mission that had brought Franklin to London placed him in a delicate situation. He was not an official ambassador, because the colonies had no right to their own diplomatic representation. He was the representative of a local assembly, a petitioner seeking justice from the imperial authorities. He had to maintain the appearance of loyalty to the crown, while defending interests that often conflicted with London's policies. This game of appearances required tact, patience, and the ability to navigate the labyrinth of British bureaucracy and court politics. Franklin proved surprisingly effective in this role. His scientific fame opened for him the doors of drawing rooms that an ordinary colonist would never have reached. Scholars and aristocrats wanted to meet the man who had tamed lightning. Politicians were curious about his views on American affairs. Franklin made use of these connections with his characteristic blend of personal charm and cool-headed calculation. He did not push aggressively or issue ultimatums. He presented his arguments calmly and methodically, gave his interlocutors time to reflect, and built relationships founded on mutual respect. The first London mission ended in partial success. Franklin secured favorable rulings in the dispute with the Penns, though not all of the colonies' demands were met. More important than the concrete results was the experience he gained. He came to understand the mechanisms of the British Empire, established contacts with influential figures, and mastered the language of diplomacy and the art of compromise. These skills would prove invaluable in the years ahead, when the stakes of the game would multiply many times over. His time in England made Franklin keenly aware of the depth of the divide separating the colonies from the mother country. The British, even those most sympathetic to America, treated colonists as second-class subjects, people deserving of care and guidance, but not equal rights. This attitude, though rarely expressed openly, permeated every layer of British society and every institution of the state. Franklin, who had arrived in London as a loyal subject of the Crown, was beginning to understand that this loyalty might have its limits. When he returned to America in 1762, Franklin was not yet a revolutionary. He still believed that the disputes between the colonies and the mother country could be resolved through negotiation and reform. He was among the first to propose the idea of a union of colonies which, while remaining loyal to the Crown, would gain greater internal autonomy and a shared representation before London. This plan, known as the Albany Plan, was ahead of its time and found support neither in America nor in England. The colonists were not yet ready for unity, and the British had no intention of sharing power. The events of the following years systematically undermined Franklin's faith in the possibility of reconciliation. New taxes imposed on the colonies without their consent, trade restrictions, the stationing of British troops in American cities. All of this stirred growing resistance. Franklin watched these developments with mounting unease, publishing articles and pamphlets defending the rights of colonists, while still appealing for reason and compromise on both sides of the Atlantic. A particularly important role in shaping his views was played by his journalism. Franklin possessed a rare talent for writing. He could present complex arguments in a manner that was clear, accessible, and often witty. His pamphlets circulated throughout England and America, read in coffeehouses and drawing rooms, discussed in political circles. One of them, written in the form of an ironic instruction manual for the British government, laid out 12 ways to diminish a great empire. This text, seemingly playful, was in fact a bitter diagnosis of the errors of British colonial policy and a warning about their consequences. Summoned to London again in 1764, Franklin spent another decade there, trying to diffuse the growing conflict. It was a mission doomed to failure from the outset. The positions of both sides grew ever more intractable, and the space for compromise shrank with each passing month. Franklin conducted countless conversations, wrote memorials and petitions, and called on every contact he had. None of it led anywhere. The British government, convinced of its own strength and righteousness, had no intention of yielding to rebellious colonists. The turning point came in 1773, when Franklin publicly revealed the private correspondence of the British governor of Massachusetts, which demonstrated that this official had been urging London to use repressive measures against the colonists. The scandal was enormous. Franklin was summoned before the Privy Council and publicly humiliated by the Solicitor General, who spent an hour hurling insults at him, calling him a thief and an agitator. This scene, played out before an amused aristocracy, finally convinced Franklin that reconciliation was impossible. He left England in March 1775, a few weeks before the first shots of the War for Independence were fired. Crossing the Atlantic, he recorded his observations on ocean currents and took measurements of water and air temperature. Even in a moment of personal crisis and national tragedy, he remained a scholar in search of knowledge about the natural world. But his thoughts were directed above all toward America and what was coming. Deborah had died a few months before his return, without living to see her husband again. Franklin regretted to the end of his life that he had spent so many years away from her, that he had not been at her side in her final hours. This personal loss compounded his political one, the loss of faith in the empire he had served throughout his adult life. The man who returned to America in the spring of 1775 was someone different from the one who had left it 18 years earlier. He was now ready for revolution. The ship carrying Franklin back to America reached shore in May 1775. Just a month earlier, the first shots of the war had been fired at Lexington and Concord, a conflict that would last 8 years and transform the face of the continent. A 69-year-old Franklin was returning to a country plunged into the chaos of armed conflict, with no clear prospects of victory, no allies on the international stage, and not even a formal declaration of independence. In these circumstances, he could have chosen a quiet retirement, withdrawn from public life, and spent his remaining years in the company of family and friends. He chose differently. The very day after arriving in Philadelphia, Franklin was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress, the body representing all the rebellious colonies. He was the oldest member of that assembly, a full generation older than most of the delegates. His diplomatic experience, worldliness, and scientific authority made him an extraordinary figure among men who were, for the first time, facing the necessity of making decisions of historical consequence. His younger colleagues treated him with a mixture of respect and admiration, seeking his counsel on the most difficult questions. The Congress deliberated in an atmosphere of uncertainty and disagreement. Some delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain, viewing armed resistance merely as a means of pressure to compel London into concessions. Others believed the time for compromise had passed irreversibly, and that only full independence could guarantee the colonies freedom and security. Franklin belonged to the latter group, but acted with his characteristic caution, not forcing his position but patiently persuading those who wavered. In the spring of 1776, Congress established a committee tasked with drafting a document declaring the independence of the colonies. It consisted of 5 members, among them Franklin and a young lawyer from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. This 32-year-old delegate, still largely unknown beyond his own colony, was chosen as the principal author of the text. This decision was made, in part, thanks to Franklin's support. He had recognized in Jefferson a literary talent and depth of thought surpassing many of his older colleagues. Jefferson worked on the document for several weeks, consulting individual passages with the other committee members. Franklin, despite his authority and literary experience, made no attempt to impose his own vision on his younger colleague, confining himself to stylistic and substantive suggestions while respecting Jefferson's primary authorship. A number of his corrections have survived, small changes in phrasing that gave the text greater force without altering its essence. It was the work of an editor, not a co-author but an editor with an extraordinary sense of language. The presentation of the document before Congress was a moment of great stress for Jefferson. The young author watched as delegates debated every sentence, proposed changes, and struck out entire passages. The debate lasted 3 days and was a genuine ordeal for the sensitive Jefferson. Franklin, seated beside him, noticed his distress and decided to ease the tension with a story. He mentioned a hatter of his acquaintance who had ordered a sign for his shop bearing his name, occupation, and a drawing of a hat. Various friends successively suggested removing one element or another as superfluous, until in the end only the drawing of the hat remained, with no text at all. The moral was plain. Any text subjected to collective review will be trimmed, but what matters is preserving the essentials. The Declaration of Independence was adopted by Congress on July 2, 1776, and solemnly proclaimed 2 days later. Franklin was among its signatories, placing his name beneath a document that made him a traitor in the eyes of British law. Legend has it that during the signing ceremony, one of the delegates remarked that they must all now hang together, to which Franklin replied that if they did not hang together, they would most assuredly hang separately. This anecdote may be a later invention, but it captures perfectly the atmosphere of those days, a mixture of solemn grandeur and mortal danger, Franklin's role in the creation of the Declaration went beyond editorial work and moral support for Jefferson, however. As a committee member, he took part in formulating the document's foundational ideas, in discussions about the natural rights of man, the sources of political power, and the relationship between the governed and those who govern them. His philosophy, shaped by decades of reading and reflection, influenced the way these fundamental questions were articulated. The Declaration was not the work of a single man, but a collective effort of minds formed by the Enlightenment tradition, and Franklin was one of the most distinguished representatives of that tradition in America. Particularly close to his heart were the ideas contained in the Declaration concerning the equality of all people and their inalienable rights. Franklin, who had believed throughout his life in the possibility of social advancement based on talent and hard work, saw in these words a confirmation of his deepest convictions. A man born into a soapmaker's family could become a scholar and diplomat, not because some ruler had graciously permitted it, but because he possessed an inalienable right to pursue happiness on his own terms. This conviction, though not always realized in the social practice of the time, represented a revolutionary shift in how human relations were conceived. Franklin was also the only signatory of the Declaration with direct experience of negotiating with the British government. He knew better than anyone that words written on paper would not be enough to realize the ideals they contained. Independence had to be won on the battlefields and at the negotiating table. The Continental Army, commanded by George Washington, was fighting an adversary with superior numbers, better weapons, and the virtually unlimited resources of the world's greatest empire. Without outside help, the chances of victory were minimal. Congress quickly grasped that it needed allies in Europe, and the only candidate capable of effectively pursuing such alliances was Franklin. His scientific fame, diplomatic experience, and personal charm made him the ideal emissary to France, Great Britain's greatest rival on the European continent. In October 1776, at the age of 70, Franklin set out on yet another crossing of the Atlantic. This time, not as a petitioner seeking justice in London, but as the representative of a new nation seeking allies in Paris. It was a mission fraught with enormous personal risk. Had the ship been intercepted by the British Navy, Franklin would have been arrested as a traitor and, in all likelihood, hanged. The voyage lasted more than a month, under conditions that must have been exhausting for a man of 70. Franklin used the time productively nonetheless, conducting scientific observations of ocean currents and recording notes that he later published. Even in the face of mortal danger and a historic mission, he remained a scholar for whom every moment was an opportunity to expand his knowledge of the world. Arriving in France, Franklin stepped onto a political stage of remarkable complexity. France was an absolute monarchy, governed by Louis XVI and his court at Versailles. Openly supporting Republican rebels fighting against a legitimate monarch was a delicate matter for the French king. On the other hand, France still remembered the humiliations it had suffered in the 7 Years' War, the loss of Canada and other territories to Great Britain. The prospect of weakening its ancient enemy was tempting, even if it required backing revolutionaries whose ideas were potentially dangerous to the French monarchy itself. Franklin understood these dilemmas and knew he had to proceed carefully. He could not officially act as an ambassador, since France did not yet recognize the United States. He therefore adopted the pose of a private citizen, a scholar seeking tranquility and the company of enlightened minds. This mask allowed him to move freely among the French elite, without embarrassing the government at Versailles. At the same time, his scientific reputation, which had preceded him across the continent, made him a figure impossible to ignore. In Paris, Franklin took up residence in a suburban estate where he kept a salon that drew the intellectual and aristocratic cream of French society. He deliberately cultivated the image of a straightforward American, wearing plain clothes and a fur cap instead of the wigs and silks required at court. This image, which was in reality a sophisticated exercise in personal branding, delighted Frenchmen, weary of the artificiality of their own world. Franklin embodied for them the Rousseauian dream of a return to nature, to simplicity and virtue. Congress had sent him to win an ally for struggling America. Franklin was doing far more than that. He was building the myth of America in the European imagination, the myth of a land of freedom and opportunity, where a man is judged by his merits, not his birth. This myth, though far removed from the complex reality of American society, had enormous drawing power and shaped the way Europe perceived the conflict across the ocean. Paris received Franklin with an enthusiasm no other foreigner of that era had experienced. His likeness was reproduced on medallions, snuff boxes, fans, and every conceivable object of daily use. Ladies of the highest society wore hairstyles a la Franklin, imitating his fur cap. Portraits of the American philosopher hung in drawing rooms, alongside images of the king himself. This explosion of popularity might have turned the head of a younger man, but the 70-year-old Franklin exploited it coolly and methodically, as a tool in the service of his mission. The diplomatic situation he found himself in demanded extraordinary patience and finesse. France, though clearly sympathetic to the American cause, could not openly act against Great Britain without risking a new war for which it was not yet prepared. The government at Versailles was playing a double game, officially maintaining neutrality while unofficially supporting the rebels with shipments of arms and money channeled through intermediaries. Franklin had to navigate this gray zone, accepting help that officially did not exist and expressing gratitude for support that officially no one was providing. The key figure in these behind-the-scenes operations was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, a playwright known as the author of comedies that had delighted all of Europe. This watchmaker's son, who through talent and cunning had risen to the heights of French society, harbored deep sympathy for the American cause. With the knowledge and quiet approval of royal ministers, Beaumarchais established a fictitious trading company through which shipments of muskets, gunpowder, cannons, and uniforms flowed to America. Without this officially non-existent aid, Washington's army could not have continued to fight. Franklin met with Beaumarchais regularly, coordinating deliveries and conveying information about the needs of the Continental Army. The two men, so different in temperament and style, found common ground in their devotion to the cause of liberty. For the playwright, who in his works had mocked the privileges of aristocracy and championed the rights of ordinary people, the American Revolution was the embodiment of the ideals he proclaimed on stage. For Franklin, Beaumarchais was an invaluable ally whose connections and energy made possible things that were impossible through official diplomatic channels. Equally important as material assistance was building support for America among the French intellectual and aristocratic elites. Franklin attended countless receptions, dinners, and salon gatherings, where the conversation appeared trivial on the surface, but in reality shaped public opinion. His presence in company was always an event. Ladies vied for a seat beside him at table. Gentlemen sought an opportunity to exchange words with the man who had tamed lightning. Franklin exploited these situations to slip in information about the American cause, to present the colonists' case, and to build sympathy for a distant country fighting for its freedom. Of particular significance was his meeting with Voltaire, the most celebrated philosopher of the age, who despite his advanced years and fragile health had returned to Paris after years of exile. The two old men, one aged 73, the other 84, met publicly at a session of the Academy of Sciences. The crowd gathered in the hall demanded that they shake hands as a token of friendship between France and America. Voltaire and Franklin embraced, and the witnesses to this scene wept with emotion. The French philosopher, addressing Franklin, spoke in English, explaining that he wished to use his guest's language. Franklin's grandson, present at the meeting, received from Voltaire a blessing in words that spread across all of Europe: God and liberty. This scene, carefully staged and publicized, was of immense symbolic value. Voltaire embodied the spirit of the Enlightenment, the critique of tyranny and superstition, faith in reason and progress. His public support for America lent the revolution an intellectual legitimacy that no government decree could have provided. Franklin understood the importance of such gestures and took care to ensure they reached as wide an audience as possible through newspapers and private correspondence. Franklin's correspondence from this period comprised hundreds of letters, addressed to the most varied recipients throughout Europe. He wrote to scholars and philosophers, to aristocrats and merchants, to ministers and journalists. Each letter was a carefully considered act of propaganda, tailored to its recipient and circumstances. Among his correspondents were people who would soon play pivotal roles in the history of their own country. A young lawyer from the province of Artois, by the name of Maximilien, wrote to Franklin with expressions of admiration, not foreseeing that as Robespierre he would become one of the most controversial figures of the French Revolution. Similarly enthusiastic letters arrived from other people whose names would soon resound throughout the history of France and Europe. The breakthrough in official Franco-American relations came at the beginning of 1778, when news reached Paris of the Continental Army's victory at Saratoga. This battle, in which American forces defeated and forced the surrender of an entire British army, proved that the rebels were capable of winning major engagements against regular troops. For France, it was the signal that investing in the American cause might pay off, that it was not backing a hopeless venture but a potential victor. Negotiations that had previously crawled along suddenly accelerated. In February 1778, France signed two treaties with the United States, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. This was the first time in history that a European power had recognized the independence of the United States and committed itself to providing military assistance. Franklin, who had spent a year and a half patiently laying the groundwork for this agreement, could at last celebrate a diplomatic triumph. The signing ceremony took place with Franklin and two other American commissioners present. For the occasion, Franklin wore an old, out-of-fashion coat, which drew puzzled looks from those present. Asked about his choice, he explained that it was the same coat he had worn years earlier in London when he had been publicly humiliated by the British Solicitor General. He wanted that same garment to be a witness to his triumph. This anecdote, regardless of whether it is true, perfectly illustrates Franklin's character, his long memory, his sense of drama, and his ability to transform personal experiences into symbols with broader meaning. The alliance with France fundamentally altered the dynamic of the war. It was no longer a matter of suppressing a colonial uprising, but of a global conflict between European powers. The French fleet threatened British supply lines. French money financed Washington's army. French officers trained American soldiers. Among them, a particularly prominent place was occupied by the young Marquis de Lafayette, who, despite the objections of his family and the court, had sailed to America to fight alongside the rebels. Franklin had presented him before his departure with a golden sword and a letter of thanks, beginning a friendship that endured to the end of his life. The following years of war brought varying fortunes, but the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt. In 1781, the combined American and French forces compelled the surrender of the British Army at Yorktown, sealing the fate of the conflict. Peace negotiations dragged on for another 2 years, but Franklin, despite his advanced age and deteriorating health, participated in them to the end, ensuring that the terms of the treaty were as favorable as possible for his country. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, officially ended the war and recognized the independence of the United States. Great Britain ceded to the new state vast territories, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to Florida. These were terms more favorable than anyone could have anticipated at the outset of the conflict. Franklin, who had worked toward this result for 7 years, could regard his achievement with deep satisfaction. The nation that had not existed when he set out for Paris was now a recognized member of the family of nations, with its own territory, government, and place on the map of the world. The mission had been accomplished, but Franklin remained in France for another 2 years, attending to the trade and financial affairs of the new state. His health was declining. Gout made walking difficult. Kidney stones caused him unceasing pain. Despite this, he continued to work, received visitors, maintained his correspondence, and participated in the scientific life of Paris. Only in 1785, at the age of 79, did he obtain Congress's permission to return home. France bade him farewell with the honors due a hero, and King Louis XVI presented him on his departure with a miniature portrait set with diamonds. An extraordinary gesture toward anyone, and all the more so toward the representative of a republic. The ship carrying Franklin to America sailed from Le Havre in July 1785. The crossing of the Atlantic took 6 weeks, and was a genuine test of endurance for a man of 79. Despite the pain and discomfort, Franklin used the time at sea to record scientific observations about ocean water temperature and the behavior of sea currents. To the very end, he remained a man for whom every moment was an opportunity to enlarge his knowledge of the world, even as his body was failing him and the horizon of life was visibly narrowing. Philadelphia welcomed its most celebrated citizen with honors no American had ever received before or since. Church bells rang throughout the day, crowds filled the streets, and official delegations offered their tributes. Franklin received these honors with his characteristic mixture of gratitude and ironic detachment. He knew better than anyone that fame is fleeting, and that a person's true significance is measured not by ovations, but by the endurance of what they created. He might now at last have rested, enjoyed the company of family and friends, tended his gardens, and carried on a leisurely correspondence with scholars around the world. But this was not to be. Pennsylvania immediately elected him president of its executive council, an office equivalent to that of state governor. Franklin accepted the position and held it for 3 terms until 1788. During the same period, he took part in the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention, which drafted the fundamental law of the United States. He was the oldest delegate to that assembly, and the only one to sign all 4 of the founding documents of the new state: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Peace Treaty with Great Britain, and the Constitution. The final years of his life Franklin at last spent in the company of family, in a house he had expanded and embellished according to his own ideas. His daughter Sarah lived with him, along with her husband and children. The grandchildren filled the house with noise and joy, qualities that had been absent through the long years spent in public service far from his loved ones. Franklin relished this domestic atmosphere, though illness increasingly confined his activity. Gout kept him bedridden for weeks at a time. Kidney stones caused unremitting pain relieved only by opium prescribed by his doctors. Despite these physical limitations, Franklin's mind remained clear and active. He wrote tirelessly, completing the autobiography he had begun many years earlier, maintaining correspondence with friends in Europe and America, and publishing articles on subjects close to his heart. Among these subjects, a particularly prominent place was occupied by the question of slavery, which in the last years of his life had become his primary moral concern. For much of his life, Franklin had accepted slavery as a feature of social reality, though he had never been an enthusiast of the institution. He had himself owned enslaved people in earlier years, treating it as the norm of his time and milieu. Over time, his views evolved. Travel in Europe, contact with Enlightenment philosophers, and reflection on the ideals of liberty he had proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, all led him to an ever deeper conviction of the injustice and inhumanity of the slave system. In 1787, Franklin became president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the oldest organization in America dedicated to the abolition of slavery. Under his leadership, the society expanded its activities not only to oppose the slave trade, but also to support the education and welfare of freed African Americans. Franklin committed his personal authority and financial resources to this cause, convinced that American independence would be incomplete so long as millions of people remained in bondage. A few weeks before his death, Franklin wrote a text that can be regarded as his moral testament on this question. It was a satire parodying the arguments of slavery's defenders by placing them in the mouth of a fictional Muslim, upholding the right to enslave Christians. The irony was caustic, the argumentation brilliant, and the message clear. There is no moral justification for treating human beings as property, regardless of the color of their skin or their faith. Franklin wrote elsewhere that slavery was a cruel degradation of human nature, that a man long treated as an animal frequently loses his sense of personal dignity, and that the chains binding the body bind also the capacities of the mind and the feelings of the heart. These were prophetic words, spoken 70 years before the Civil War, that would finally abolish slavery in the United States. The legacy that Franklin left to America and the world is difficult to overstate. As a scholar, he laid the foundations for a modern understanding of electricity and contributed to the advancement of many other fields of science. As an inventor, he created devices that saved lives and improved the daily comfort of millions. As an organizer of public life, he founded institutions that have endured for centuries: libraries, universities, fire brigades, and civic associations. As a diplomat, he secured the alliances without which American independence would have remained a dream. As a writer and thinker, he shaped the way Americans think about themselves and their country. But perhaps the most enduring element of his legacy is the example of his own life. Franklin proved that a man born into the most modest of circumstances could rise to the heights of intellectual, social, and political achievement. His journey from a soap-maker's workshop to the Salon at Versailles, from 2 years of schooling to membership in the world's most distinguished scientific academies, became a model for generations of Americans, and not only Americans, seeking inspiration for their own efforts towards self-realization and improvement. The epitaph that Franklin wrote for himself at the age of 23 proved, with the perspective of later decades, remarkably apparent. He compared his body to an old book whose cover is worn and whose pages are torn, but whose content will not be lost. It will appear in a new edition, revised and improved by the author. This metaphor, uniting the professional experience of a printer with faith in the immortality of the human spirit, is the quintessence of Franklin's character. Practical, but not without spiritual depth, witty but never cynical, aware of his own mortality but not oppressed by that awareness. In the final weeks of his life, Franklin spoke with visiting friends about the future of America and the world. He expressed regret that science had not yet discovered a way to freeze a person and restore him to life after the passage of years, so that he might see how the fate of humanity had unfolded. This half-joking remark testifies that to the very end, he remained a man turned toward the future, fascinated by the possibilities it held, convinced that humanity's finest hours were yet to come. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790, at the age of 84. His funeral drew 20,000 people, the largest crowd ever assembled in Philadelphia. The United States Congress declared a month of national mourning, and the National Assembly of France, meeting in revolutionary Paris, honored his memory with 3 days of mourning. The man who had been born a British subject in a provincial colonial town departed as a citizen of the world, mourned on 2 continents. His face, placed on the $100 bill, became one of the most recognizable images in the world. But Franklin's true monument is not made of paper or bronze. It is made up of the institutions he founded, the ideas he championed, and the example he set. It consists of every public library, making books available to those who cannot afford to buy them, every lightning rod, protecting a building from fire from the sky, every person who believed they could transcend the boundaries set for them by birth and circumstance. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story about Benjamin Franklin.